At the top of the list of philosophical and cultural niches people find really cool right now is Neoplatonism. There are admittedly hundreds of videos on Neoplatonism, and one could definitely walk away from a few of them having at least a decent understanding of what Neoplatonism was and is. So, in this series, I'll attempt to delineate a thorough understanding of Neoplatonism by way of 4 of its most influential philosophers, along with the adjacent philosophical, religious, and cultural groups by which Neoplatonism was influenced and itself influenced. Perhaps most significantly, we'll also discuss how a practical application of Neoplatonic thought called Theurgy has influenced the occult and, more specifically, magic, down to the present day. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. We've covered quite a bit of Platonic thought on this channel by way of certain topics such as magic, astrology, Kabbalah, and Gnosticism. By now it should be fairly plain that the Plato you were spoon-fed in school was likely heavily interpreted through a mundane, modern lens, and missing a crucial piece. The dialogues of Plato, which come to us intact through nearly 2,500 years of tumultuous human history, are not merely a series of moral, socio-political, or epistemological treatises. They are mystical in nature. It's not typical for an average student to devour the Platonic dialogues, though kudos to those who have. It's more probable that during the course of our education, we were forced to read the Symposium, or perhaps some part of the Republic, as an honorable nod to Plato. Yet, his contribution to the entire history of thought is probably among the most significant of all time. Think of this. We still talk about and teach his dialogues today, 2.5 millennia after his death. Here are a few major contributions of the Platonic dialogues. Plato founded the Academia, which is thought to be the first Western academic institution. Plato placed strong emphasis on the paideia, or education of the soul. He conceptualized this as the contemplation of and coming to know the capital G good. This was in part self-knowledge, knowledge of the patterns inherent in the objective or created world, and the development of certain virtues toward a virtuous way of life. The realm of forms was Plato's answer to the ancient metaphysical problem of universals, that is, should the properties an object has in common with other objects, such as color and shape, be considered to exist beyond those objects. Plato believed that these qualities were products of intangible forms which pre-exist matter. He termed this the realm or world of ideas or forms. These found their translation into figures or patterns which were observable in nature and mathematics, principally by the study of geometry. Since this realm pre-existed the material, the soul, which was at least for a time independent of matter in between lives, was believed by Plato to have knowledge of these forms, and therefore Plato conceptualized all learning as a form of remembering, anamnesis. Plato distinguishes between the utility of earthly knowledge and knowledge which transcends the earthly, such as the knowledge of the capital G good, and subsequent conformity to it. In this way, he challenges the sophists of his day, coining the term rhetoric to describe their modus operandi, rather than proper philosophy. He also stressed self-knowledge, since a person cannot learn anything about that which they believe themselves to already understand. He also repeatedly challenged the deeply held beliefs which were common or stereotypical in his day. Plato believed that the only way to true justice is through the rectification of the self. A true philosopher was the only being fit to rule, democracy being repugnant, because the masses were largely ignorant due to lack of education. But before you start patting yourselves on your Letterman jackets, let's keep in mind that the education which Plato speaks of has to do with knowledge that is by and large dismissed by modern academia. In Plato's conception, self-regulation of the individual was the only way to a well-regulated society. In Platonic cosmogony and cosmology, the universe was created by a being called the Demiurge, using the realm of forms as a sort of blueprint for the various created things of the material universe. This being was largely good, as its creation was modeled on perfect forms. Plato also conceived of a realm beyond the material called the Ogdoad, or eighth sphere, beyond the realm of causality, that is, the physical cosmos, where the soul traveled after physical death to meet with reward or punishment based on the actions of their past lives. Souls allowed to continue onward into new lives were given the opportunity to choose those lives, and their choice of lives was typically influenced by the experience of the life they just had. They also chose a guiding spirit called a Diamon, the root of the word daimon being related to division, perhaps denoting an intermediary of sorts, between the human soul in incarnation and the superior realms of the gods. After being bound to this mediating spirit, they were further bound to the karmic mechanism of the universe and their memories of past lives wiped clean before being born again in the material. The education of the soul, or paideia, was an undoing of this forgetfulness and a remembering of the divine nature, which could only practically be accomplished by embodying the virtues of the good in their physical existence. This relied nearly completely on philosophy. Plato also believed the universe itself to be an ensouled being, a macrocosmic entity composed of a near infinitude of microcosms. From all these, and much more, we derive the thought of early, middle, and late Platonism. Late Platonism being synonymous with the academic and more popular term Neoplatonism, as well as the operative philosophies underlying theurgy, the cosmogony and cosmology of Gnosticism, the Aristotelian Lyceum, and the Peripatetic school, the early theology of Christianity, and the philosophy of Stoicism. These philosophies have extended themselves through the annals of time and history to the present day, where some of them are prevailing paradigms in certain parts of the world and sectors of academia and popular culture. With this as our starting point, let's have a look in broad strokes at the evolution of Platonic thought. The earliest Platonists, often referred to as early Platonists or academics, included the Platonic successors or scholarchs, rulers of the school, Speusippus, Xenocrates, Polemon, and Crates, as well as notables such as Aristotle, Eudoxus, Heraclides, and the women Lastinia of Mantinea and Axiothea of Philos. This iteration of the school is typically divided into several periods, most often Old, Middle, and New. The next school of Platonism were the Middle Platonists, beginning with Antiochus of Ascalon between 130 and 68 CE. During the era of Middle Platonism, which spanned around 300 to 400 years, several Platonic ideas were evolved and somewhat modified, such as the Demiurge, for example. In Plato's Timaeus, wherein the Demiurge and his methods of creating the physical universe are elaborated, the Demiurge is conceived of as being ultimately good and beneficent in his machinations and workings. However, during the Middle Platonist era, the role of the Demiurge is gradually transformed from one of benevolence to that of ignorance, and to some capacity, ignorant malevolence. This becomes significant when we see how later Platonic thought conceives of the universe and humankind's place within it. Notable students of this school were Plutarch, Philo of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Apuleius, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and Ammonius Saccas, who would become the teacher of the first philosopher of the late Platonic school, or Neoplatonism, Plotinus, or, in the Greek pronunciation, Plotinus. It's important to note that Neoplatonism is an academic term, retrofitted by 19th century academics to demarcate a particular period of Platonic thought. We begin our survey of Neoplatonism proper here, with the philosophy of Plotinus. It is agreed among scholars and practitioners alike that Plotinus reoriented Platonic philosophy in such a significant direction so as to clearly mark the beginning of a new era, or a new school, of Platonic thought. Much of what we understand about Plotinus' life comes to us from a biography composed by his student Porphyry. Plotinus was born in the Greco-Roman town of Lycopolis, Egypt, in either 204 or 205 CE. He took to philosophy around the age of 28, traveling to the metropolitan city of Alexandria and finding what to his estimation was exactly the kind of teacher he had been looking for in the Middle Platonic philosopher Ammonius Saccas. Studying under Ammonius Saccas for between 10 and 11 years, Plotinus then attached himself to a military expedition in order to study philosophy in Persia and India. However, this pilgrimage was cut short when the presiding emperor, Gordian III, was assassinated by his troops. At which point Plotinus turned his attention to Rome, traveling there in 245 CE and teaching a version of Platonic philosophy as expounded by his teacher Ammonius, and, significantly, writing nothing. Plotinus's philosophy was posthumously collected and edited by Porphyry, and comes to us as a collected work entitled the Enneads. These derive their name from their groupings, which Porphyry somewhat artificially partitioned into 6 groups of 9, hence the term Ennead, Enea being 9 in Greek. Within these treatises is contained Plotinus's finely honed philosophy concerning natural philosophy, cosmology, epistemology, psychology, ontology, metaphysics, numbers, the first principle, and the nature of the intellect and the soul. Plotinian philosophy is labyrinthian, but from a cursory distillation, we might obtain certain important doctrines, such as the three hypostases, the one, the intellect, and the soul. Within the general ancient philosophical movement of the West, the nature of the ground of being was something variously speculated upon by philosophers since pre-Socratic times. In essence, the production of the many from the one. These first principles are known as the three hypostases. Hypostasis meaning to stand under, something like an underlying basis or foundation. To Plotinus, the one, to en, was the ground from which multiplicity came forth. Yet this one was more an essence than a thing. The one remains for Plotinus an indescribable and indivisible ultimate reality. For Plotinus, this was no innovation on his part, but rather had been recognized throughout the greater Platonic tradition, beginning with Plato himself. He points to Plato's Republic, wherein Plato terms this principle to agathon, the good. Yet even these terms cannot explain it, only intimate a vague shadow of an idea of its nature. So how does this one generate the many? According to Plotinus, by emanation. Our minds, when attempting to conceptualize this emanation, will likely revert to temporal succession. That is, a series of emanations which take place one after the other. However, in Plotinian thought, this emanative principle is described more accurately by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as an, quote, atemporal ontological dependence. The fullness of the one, in accordance with its nature, necessarily overflows, generating the first true principle, nous, or intellect. Nous was considered the first true principle, as arche, or foundation, of all subsequent existences, possessing the capability of contemplation and self-awareness, whereas the one remains undifferentiated and therefore unable to be conceptualized with any semblance of difference or differentiation. Intellect, or nous, to Plotinus was tantamount to the realm of forms, this being the essential cognitive identity expounded in the Timaeus, where Plato says that the form of an intelligible animal is eternally contemplated by the demiurge. Therefore, the forms, as superordinate principles, exist as iterations of, or derivations from the one, and are only able to be contemplated within the realm of intellect, rendering them intelligible. Without this intelligibility of the forms, there can be no substantive truth or non-arbitrary qualitative attributions. This all gets pretty philosophically abstract, but suffice it to say that the intellect in the Plotinian philosophy is essentially the highest possible concept of mind or conscious perception, the highest activity of life. It is by this divine intellection that the unmanifest infinitude of potentiality is given individuated potentiality. Essentially, it is the divisible reality, as opposed to the indivisible reality of the one. Plotinus found a consonance with this idea in Aristotle's unmoved mover, yet believed Aristotle in error on supposing that the intellect was the substantive ground of all being, rather than the apophatic one. He agrees that the intellect is among the prime forces, yet not of itself the sole generator of all, since there must be a distinction between the thinker and the thing thought of. Philosophical schools within the broader milieu of religious paganism of this time did not resemble neo-pagan communities of today, clearly. They espoused a species of ultimate monotheism, which we can alternately term monism or henotheism. They believed all multiplicity stemmed from a single source, the One. Yet to Plotinus, the One, rather than being a true first principle, was something which had to exist consubstantially or coterminally with the first principle. He refers to the first principle, intellect, alternately as nous, mind, theos, God, and demiurgos, the demiurge. To Plotinus, the soul is not intellect, but rather desire. There's a kind of analogous relationship here. Soul is to intellect as intellect is to the One. While the intellect contemplates forms within the One, the soul desires that which is external to it. In this we see a kind of unfoldment taking place. The eternal potentiality of the absolute, undifferentiated unity, an awareness of the inherent potentialities as forms internal to the undifferentiated, and finally a projection of those forms as qualities which comprise an object of desire, leading consciousness outward from a somewhat latent but unified state. The soul serves as a kind of link between the intellect and the created physical world. We refer back to the Platonic idea of the psyche kosmou, or world soul. The soul of an individual is a part of this cosmic soul. The final product of this sequence, so to speak, is matter, which Plotinus defines as evil and the source of all evils by way of privation, a compelling of the human form to specific behaviors in order to enable its continued existence. This is less a modern conception of the problem of evil and more a metaphysical concept of evil. In essence, from a Platonic perspective, matter is indeterminate, unless informed by the underlying forms participating in divine intellect. Therefore, it is a potentiality which continually remains unrealized, in that it can never measure up to the perfection and eternal quality of the forms which it attempts to express, because its nature is one of decay and dissolution, and therefore will interminably fall short of the perfect. It will never be as capital G good as that which is unmanifest. Evil is in this sense rather imperfection, unrealized potential. Yet how, as opposed to why, can the one or the capital G good be the source of what is ultimately evil? We can turn once again to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us work out the problem, at least from an ethical perspective. Quote, "This is not because the body itself is evil. More typically, attachment to the body represents a desire not for form, but a corrupt desire for the non-intelligible or limitless." End quote. It's important to note here that the idea of the soul hypostasis is not identical in Platonian works to the individual soul. Plotinus' conception of the human experience is one that is likely quite familiar to most esotericists today, the body as vehicle for the soul. In Plotinus' case, a division of cognitive being or intellect, and the hybrid of physical body and soul, being the aspect of the embodied existence which constantly pulls the higher cognitive faculty away from higher contemplation and toward the immediate needs and sensual material desires, which he considers as non-cognitive. It's important to keep in mind that when we talk about things such as cognitive and intellective and intelligible, Plotinus isn't so much talking about the individual processes of mind as we would conceptualize them today in modern psychology or cognitive studies. Concerning these things, he's speaking more of that abstract, hypostatic, divine mental activity. This higher cognitive aspect to Plotinus is more definitive than the lower, non-cognitive aspects. That is to say, the cognitive aspect is eternally linked to the highest intellect, mirroring its activities of contemplation. It's only in this way, according to Plotinus, that Plato's doctrine of anamnesis can work. The intellective aspect of ourselves is united to the higher intellect, which contemplates and has knowledge of the eternal forms, and therefore, in a sense, remains undescended, or at least not fully descended into the material. Of the individual soul, Plotinus writes, The soul is a divine being and dwells in more heavenly places, but has entered the body. The soul is a minor god, a derivative aspect of the divine, but compelled by its powers, and due to its tendency to bring order to whatever is beneath it, it penetrates to this lower sphere, in a voluntary plunge. If it turns back quickly, all is well. It will not be injured by acquiring the knowledge of evil and coming to understand sin. But the soul may dive too deep into matter, and linger too long, and get stuck. The options presented to the embodied person, therefore, can either be a contemplation and action based on higher intelligible principles, leading toward unity with the One, or acting upon the desires and emotions of the material inclination generated by the body and the sensible world. This leads away from the higher, away from the One, and toward the decaying and dissolving tendencies of the material. To Plotinus, the contemplative action of the mind must culminate in what he called theoria, a vision of the One, the source of all things. The proper application of will toward the reunion with the higher manifests in ethics. Ethics, in Plotinus's view, were the acquisition of specific virtues which led a person's behavior away from deference to materiality and toward the more intellective capacities inherent to that aspect of the organism which still remained undescended from the hypostasis of intellect. Therefore, Plotinus is said to have been averse to vanity and indulgence in all forms. According to most recollections, he was somewhat of an ascetic. He refused even to have his image engraven in stone, claiming that it would be but an image of an image. Despite this, Plotinus was not a world hater. In fact, he dedicated an entire treatise against the Gnostic schools of thought for this reason precisely. While Plotinus viewed matter itself as the locus of metaphysical evil, he did not believe the same of the world soul. Therefore, the cosmos itself was not inherently evil or debased, but the locus of evil was rather the substance of matter itself, highly. He also disagreed with the Gnostics in that knowledge and salvation was reserved for a select few, a predetermined group holding privileged information. Plotinus viewed what he perceived to be their arrogance as the surest sign of their error. Plotinus's philosophy would transform the Platonic lineage and inherently reorient philosophy in a particular direction for at least the next 1,000 years. Therefore, he is considered the father of Neoplatonism. Modern Western esotericists, perhaps more well-versed now in Eastern philosophies than in the past several hundred years, might notice some congruence between Plotinus's interpretation of Platonic thought and Eastern Vedic and Vedantic philosophies, as well as certain forms of Buddhism and esoteric Taoism. This may have come from the influence of his teacher Ammonius Saccas. It has been posited by some researchers that the name Ammonius Saccas was less a given name and more of an epithet, as the etymological roots of these words appear to be corrupted loanwords resembling Saccas, the Greek term for the Indo-Scythians. Similar to the epithet given to the Buddha of India, Sakyamuni, meaning Scythian teacher, Ammonius Saccas was an inversion of this, meaning essentially the same thing. This would render the title Ammonius Saccas as the Scythian teacher, implying him to be from parts east. This may also explain Plotinus's early efforts to investigate the philosophy of India. We could literally spend hours on Plotinus's philosophy, but the ground we have covered provides us with an adequate starting point to go forward. The next figure at the mantle of the late or Neoplatonic lineage was Plotinus's student, Porphyry. A lot of P's here. Porphyrius of Tyre, better known today as Porphyry, was born in Roman Phoenicia around 234 CE. His birth name in the Semitic language of his homeland was Malchus, meaning king, which he rendered in Greek as Vasileos. However, his nickname, given to him by an early teacher named Longinus, was Porphyrius, meaning purple, likely alluding to purple as being the color of royal robes, due to how complicated it was to manufacture that dye in former times. He was introduced to Middle Platonism, rhetoric, and grammar in Athens, and later went to Rome, where he sought out Plotinus as a teacher. After coming under Plotinus's tutelage, he entered into the line of what we now call Neoplatonic philosophy. Yet his experience was jarring. After devoting his life to Neoplatonism as taught by Plotinus, he became suicidal, at which point Plotinus advised he go to Sicily to recover his mental health. Porphyry stayed in Sicily for 5 years before returning to Rome after Plotinus' death, and began to teach and collect Plotinus' writings and philosophy into the volume which would become known as the Enneads. Despite what paltry few of Porphyry's works come to us, he remains one of the most influential writers in the history of philosophy and thought in general. However, rather than being the innovator Plotinus may seem to have been, though Plotinus surely would not have thought of his work in philosophy in such a light, Porphyry was a great promoter and advancer of late Platonism. He wrote a treatise entitled Aids to the Study of the Intelligibles, a basic summary and primary for the study of Platonism. His introduction, or Isagoge, a short treatise appended as a commentary to Aristotle's categories, introduced logic into the stream of Neoplatonic thought, and Porphyry was and remains well known for his precision of thought. Whereas Plotinus and even Plato himself do not seem altogether congruent by way of the Aristotelian lens of empiricism and rationalism. In Porphyry we find perhaps a close marriage of both. The Isagoge was the standard textbook on logic for centuries. From this text was derived the Porphyrian tree, a diagram illustrating the scale or hierarchies of being, which became a staple of medieval education and influences scientific classification to the present day. Porphyry's stance on the human soul and its condition was one of a kind of non-locality, similar to his teacher Plotinus' view. The soul itself in Porphyry's conception was transcendent and intellective, being an inherent unity, however comprised of a dual aspect, one part which contemplates the higher, and one which is concerned with the body, sense perceptions, emotions, and material nature. To Porphyry, the soul and body related to each other as an unfused union. In this sense, an aspect of the soul is preoccupied with the material, but is also able, after successive lives perhaps, to free itself from the realms of materiality, not merely periodically, but rather for good. This is clearly derivative of the Platonian conception of the dual nature of the soul, which we see intimations of in Plato's work as well. However, Plato and much of Platonism after him also expounded a third aspect of the soul, the pneuma, or spirit, the liberation of the soul from the clutches of materiality. In the Porphyrian conception was to be done by a gradual and prolonged contemplation of the higher divine intellectual aspects rather than the lower material. This is because the true nature of the soul is not material but rational, intellective, a part of the intelligible world. The intellect Porphyry speaks of is at a level of unity much higher than even ordinary reason. This was to be accompanied, of course, with a way of life that was in accordance with Platonic ethics. These ethics are summed up by Porphyry as the virtues elaborated by him from the work of Plotinus. That is, civic, purgative, contemplative, and paradigmatic. Each of these virtues he corresponds to the 4 cardinal virtues, as laid down in Plato's Republic: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. These are successively ordered, as each being a sort of prerequisite to the attainment of the other, beginning with civic and progressing onward to the paradigmatic. Porphyry was also known as one of the few ancient philosophers completely opposed to the eating of meat, a vegetarian on ethical and philosophical grounds. We find his exposition of this in his work entitled On Abstinence. Porphyry was also known for his polemics against a burgeoning and diverse religious community flourishing amid his place in time, the Christians. However, Porphyry did not attack Christ himself, nor the historicity or teachings of Christ. Rather, his main gripe seemed to be with the Christian communities themselves. As we are well aware, similar complaints are leveled to this day. Porphyry wrote some of the most important commentaries of his day, as well as biographies, which have served as source material for much of what we understand of the lives of Plotinus and Pythagoras, the acknowledged grand patriarch of the entire Greek philosophical system. He wrote a life of Plato as well, but this only comes to us in the form of quotes from it by Cyril of Alexandria. Through his anti-Christian polemics, Porphyry became known as a champion of paganism, but Let me stop all you zealot neo-pagans there before you hit post on that Yas King Porphyry meme. Porphyry was also a Platonizer of the pagan religious worship of his time. While fragments of his Philosophy from Oracles contain specific ritual protocols and astrological implications of predestination, Porphyry remained a staunch philosopher whose vision of an ordered cosmos in many ways approached that of the early Christian theologians of his day and in time to come. There is some dispute among scholars as to whether or not Porphyry was the teacher of Iamblichus, or if referencing Iamblichus as Porphyry's pupil was a way of acknowledging that he was next in line in terms of significance and impact within the Neoplatonic lineage. A split, however, comes between these two great thinkers over a highly ritualized form of what is essentially regarded as magic, a potential means to the liberation of the soul from the bondage of the material, theurgy. The word theurgy, theurgia, literally means God working, and is an operative application of Neoplatonic philosophy. Porphyry was against the use of theurgy or magic as a means of liberation from the causal spheres, because it was not pure philosophy, contemplative. Theurgy is operative. Iamblichus delineates three distinct methods or disciplines towards transcendence: philosophy, theology, and theurgy. He bases the latter upon the two former, yet ultimately, theurgy transcends both as a religious expression of the soul. Something must take the soul beyond the bounds of mere intellectual contemplation. This disagreement, and Iamblichus' defense of it, was recorded in a text entitled On the Mysteries. In it, Porphyry addresses a letter of inquiry regarding theurgic rites skeptically to a prophet named Anebo. The answer, or refutation, comes not from Anebo, but from an Egyptian priest named Ab-Ammon. A combination of Abba-Ammon, Father God, let's say, Father Ammon. This is all but unanimously agreed among scholars and philosophers today to have been Iamblichus writing pseudonymously as Ab-Ammon. Within the pages of this refutation, dismissing Porphyry's assumptions as over-intellectualizing, ultimately transcendent spiritual matters, are delineated the principles of Iamblichian theurgy. However, scarcely little is said regarding the actual rituals of theurgy themselves. Iamblichus of Chalcis was a Syrian Neoplatonic philosopher born around 245 CE, and descendant of the Emessene dynasty, a group of Arabic priest kings, essentially a dynasty operating with some autonomy but subordinate to the larger Roman Empire. After his studies in Neoplatonism, likely in Rome or Sicily, and presumably under Porphyry at some point, he returned to a town called Apamea and began his school, in which time he authored the Exhortation to Philosophy. The German philologist Karl Praechter once labeled Iamblichus as the second founder of Neoplatonism. Iamblichus elaborated Plotinus's metaphysical principles, the Three Hypostases, into a species of Platonic theology, corresponding these to gods of the Greek Pantheon. Indeed, like the Neoplatonists before him, Iamblichus was a philosopher who read mythology as symbolic analogy. Myths weren't just fairy tales, they had deep meaning and spiritual significance, and this was way before Jung or Campbell. One of the central tenets of Iamblichian theurgic philosophy served as a break with the Platonism of Plotinus, the nature of the soul. As we saw in Plotinus's philosophy, there were attenuated versions or aspects of the soul, the individual and the hypostatic. Plotinus also believed there to be a connection from the individual's projected soul to the divine or hypostatic nous or intellect. This culminated in an essentially undescended or at least not fully descended soul, as well as regarding matter to be a species of illusion, which in all likelihood accounts at least in part for his ascetic-like worldview and behavior. However, Iamblichus regards the Platonic doctrines, as well as what he regarded as the pure religious worship of the Egyptians, the soul as being fully descended. It is on this account that Iamblichus advocates theurgy as a method of sublimation and liberation of the soul. All matter, with its inherent indwelling spiritual properties, like the human being itself, must be availed as rungs on a ladder of spiritual ascent. The use of things with particular properties such as color, incense, words, music, gestures corresponded by a particular inherent divine nature, Synthemata as it is called in Iamblichian theurgy, would have the effect of heightening the soul to communion with the greater gods. Again, we use the analogy of a ladder. The aim of theurgy was to ascend the planetary spheres of the gods, back up the ladder of creation, by which the soul returns to the Ogdoad. In order to accomplish this, a theurgist must first acquire certain virtues and a lifestyle amenable to the practice of approaching the great gods of the cosmos. Successively, all classes of gods, which Iamblichus delineates, must be worshipped in turn, utilizing appropriate synthemata as their receptacles. Amid this Platonic conceptual hierarchy, a continuum of intermediaries, was the Diamon, the individual's personal divine intermediary. We might conceive of the Diamon as essentially the god of an individual's personal microcosm. We've covered the foundational Platonic document regarding the soul's incarnation and the Daimon in episode 4, The Myth of Let's backtrack just for a moment and address some of Porphyry's astrological work, as at this point it becomes pertinent to the work of Iamblichus's Theurgy. Porphyry was a bit of a technician. He attempted to discover the personal Daimon by means of astrological calculations. He would later elaborate the concept of the soul's descent through the spheres of causality, which is to say back into the physical cosmos, with the Daimon as its guide. Having been purged of its memories of previous lives and experiences within and outside of the cosmos, at each heavenly sphere the soul would take on what Porphyry called astral garments, that is, specific attributes, vices and or virtues corresponded to the 7 classical planetary bodies. Iamblichus did not view kindly the mercantile divinatory astrologers of his day, but he did view astrology and astrological calculation as being of supreme importance for the higher work of theurgy, particularly in the work of spiritual ascent. Iamblichus states, quote, "The entities visible in the heavens are all gods, and in a certain way, incorporeal." End quote. It is this retraversing of the ladder of the heavens that is a part of the work of theurgy. Taking this conception of the heavenly spheres as imparting character, and therefore fate, we can interpret the following excerpt from On the Mysteries. This work of the divine, expediting the transmigration and transformation of the soul through the material, theurgy, would come to define magical ritual in future centuries. It is exactly this type of work that was and is featured in the ritual of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, or rather its Rosicrucian inner order, as well as much of the ritual of the Eleucoans of Martina de Pasquale. It would also influence later Christian theology as well. We will cover theurgy in detail in a related series, in which we'll speak more on Iamblichus and on the mysteries. Iamblichus also wrote a biography on Pythagoras, as the Pythagorean school, Plato and Aristotle, were Iamblichus's chief philosophical influences. An important work in this lineage and for theurgy and Neoplatonism in general is a document called the Chaldean Oracles. We'll touch more on this later in this series. The Neoplatonic current would remain heavily influenced by the foundational works of Iamblichus, Plotinus, and Porphyry for several centuries. So far, we have variations of approach to the soul's transcendence of the material as posited by 3 of Neoplatonism's most influential philosophers. A species of world renunciation via the quasi-ascetic worldview of Plotinus, a contemplation of and on the divine, theoria, as opposed to a material preoccupation. In Porphyry, we have less of an asceticism, but still an admonishment to ethical living, as evidenced by his vegetarianism. Yet Porphyry's method was in some ways more classically Platonic, perhaps due to its tincture by Aristotelian thought. Pure philosophical contemplation and a rational organization of the material. In Iamblichus, we see a full embrace of materiality, yet still from the locus of a soul desiring transcendence of it, ultimately bringing us to a form of ceremonial magic called theurgy. Let's fast forward now 200 years to Proclus, the Platonic successor. According to the biography written of him by his successor Marinus, Proclus Lycaeus was born in Constantinople in 412 CE. He was educated in Alexandria and then worked as a lawyer by profession for several years, before realizing it was in philosophy where his heart and his destiny truly lay. He then studied the works of Aristotle under the tutelage of the late Platonist Olympiodorus the Elder. Eventually, Proclus became dissatisfied with the education available to him in Alexandria and made the move to Athens in Greece, studying there with the eminent philosophers of the late Platonic school, being centered there. Marinus also tells of Proclus traveling to the temple of Asclepius in his youth and receiving a message there from an image of the god Telesphorus, signifying that he would be destined for greatness. Proclus eventually went on to become the head of the academy in 437 CE. He would be among the last of the philosophers to teach at the Platonic Academy. Proclus wrote many commentaries on Platonic works, including a tremendous amount of commentary on the Platonic dialogues themselves, most of which are lost, but some of which are extant in part, as well as commentaries on Aristotle and Porphyry. Fragments of his commentary on Plotinus come to us today. His main body of work consisted in the commentary or interpretation of Plato's dialogues. His work entitled Platonic Theology is an exposition of the Platonic conception of the gods as they appear in the work of Plato, with a special focus on the Parmenides as the most theological of the dialogues. Proclus also relied heavily on the Chaldean oracles in developing this Platonic theology. His Elements of Theology remains one of the most essential texts on Neoplatonism today. Proclus was a great organizer, receptacle, and transmitter of late or Neoplatonic philosophy, as it was influenced by the great innovators before him. He was highly influenced by Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus of the late Platonic school, and was able to synthesize their contributions and interpretations of Platonic philosophy into a coherent whole. Many considered this to be his unique genius. However, some of his more personal or perhaps innovative work was done on what he called the Henads, Enna meaning one. Again, this addresses the problem of how many can come from one. Proclus starts his work with an excerpt from Plato's Parmenides. Quote, "The one neither is one, nor is." End quote. This is perhaps the finest example of apophasis in the Platonic tradition, that is, being unable to describe something in any other way than merely to say what it is not. Plotinus had also described the one apophatically as saying that it was beyond being. However, Proclus would attempt to positively describe the one as it manifested in material reality. Proclus essentially delineates a theology wherein the Platonic one is corresponded to the pagan gods. He calls the gods Henads, or ones, and explains that the idea of multiplicity is a product and property of physical ontology, as opposed to metaphysical being. Beyond the created universe, all share a super-essential existence, a sort of coexistence within the oneness beyond physical multiplicity. We could analogize this in picturing a partition or veil. On one side of this veil, we might picture nothing but, let's say, light, completely diffuse and whole. On the surface of this veil, we might picture puncture marks, holes through which beams of this light from one side of the veil penetrate through to the other. These beams would vary in size as well as location, giving them different aspects. Yet, they are still part of the same whole diffuse light on the other side. This is an admittedly futile analogy, but it helps us to begin to contemplate how something can be both one and many. Proclus points out that these aspects of the one are the divine Synthemata present in all things, which make the essence of the absolute available within multiplicity. By Proclus's time, Christianity was fiercely challenging paganism, with Emperor Theodosius' devastating proscription of all forms of paganism coming in 392. Proclus's special brand of philosophy was continued forward by a Christian philosopher, claiming conversion by St. Paul, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Whether Pseudo-Dionysius was a sincere Christian or merely a Platonist in Christian disguise, he was instrumental in carrying forth Proclean interpretations of Platonic philosophy and importing them into early Christian theology and worldview. In the next episode, we'll discuss Neoplatonism and its exchange with Hermetism and Gnosticism, as well as its influence throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance. We'll also give some honorable mentions to other Neoplatonic philosophers of consequence, discuss the translation of Neoplatonism's major works, and its transmission to and significance within the broader modern magical paradigm. Where do you stand? Are you more interested in Theoria or Theurgia? Who are some Neoplatonic philosophers you believe deserve an honorable mention? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched and practiced material like this. Patreon members also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my Egypt travel vlog, as well as other goodies. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In loops.